Today we're going to be looking at the history of beer.
Hmm.
And I promise this isn't going to be like your average, bar trivia.
Okay.
We've got Sumerian poems, medieval manuscripts, modern industry data, all to kind of give us this like really complete picture.
Wow. Sounds like we're about to open a treasure chest of knowledge.
Right. And the cool thing is we're not just talking about like what beer is, but also the why. Like why was it so important to like all these different civilizations,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And how did it transform from like, just something people made at home into like this huge global industry that we have now?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah. And what does it all tell us about like us as humans?
Okay. I'm intrigued. So, where do we start?
So let's go all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia, like around 3900 BCE. Can you imagine just like coming across a poem and it's dedicated to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing?
The goddess of brewing.
Yes. And it's not just any poem. It's essentially like the oldest beer recipe that we have.
Huh. Well, what's really cool is that it shows how advanced they were, even way back then. I mean, this recipe, it has all these steps like malting the barley and making these bread loaves, and then you have to ferment the whole mixture, and they even like knew how to filter it.
Yeah, it really changes how you think about our ancestors. Like they weren't primitive after all. They were making some pretty complex stuff. Oh, and speaking of advanced, did you know that 5,000 years ago, people in the city of Uruk were paid in beer?
Really?
I know. Crazy. Right.
Wow. That shows you just how important beer was to them. It was like their money, their food, their way of like coming together as a community.
Yeah. I wonder how that would fly in a modern workplace. But, speaking of old stories, even the Epic of Gilgamesh mentions beer. One of the oldest pieces of literature we have.
I didn't know that.
And even the so-called wild men, they were depicted enjoying a brew. So it's like this love of beer is like part of our DNA as humans.
I think you're right about that. And then you look at ancient Egypt, and beer was like a daily thing for everyone. The pharaohs, the pyramid builders, everyone.
Oh, yeah. The workers who built those massive pyramids were given like 4 to 5 liters of beer every day.
Wow, 4 to 5 liters.
Right now.
It's important to remember this wasn't about getting drunk or anything. It was about having enough energy and staying hydrated in that crazy hot desert.
Yeah. So beer basically fueled the construction of some of the most recognizable structures in history.
Pretty much.
It kind of makes you look at your next beer a little differently, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it does. But it's not just the ancients. As we move into the medieval period, you see beer just booming in Europe, especially in those places where they grow a lot of grain.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that back then, brewing was mostly done by women at home. It's pretty different from our image of the big bearded brewmaster we have today.
Yeah, very different. It really tells you about women being like the first business owners, and how crucial they were to the whole beer story.
Right.
And there's this idea that people drank beer back then because water wasn't safe, but that's not really true.
Oh, really? I always thought that was the case.
Yeah, water was definitely a lot cheaper and easier to get, so people drank beer because they liked it and because it was good for them.
Okay.
But the medieval period was also when they started using a new ingredient that would change everything. Hops.
Ah, yes, hops.
Yes.
I remember reading that before hops, beer would go bad super fast, and it was almost impossible to export it.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
Can you imagine?
Well, that's where hops came in. Hops have this natural preservative in them, which not only fixed the spoilage problem, but it also meant that they could finally start making beer that was like all the same, and they could ship it all over the place, especially in Germany.
So hops were basically the reason beer became a global thing.
Yeah, pretty much. But not everyone was happy about this new ingredient. There was this whole debate in 15th century England between people who wanted their old school unhopped ale and those who were all about this new hopped beer.
Really?
Yeah, and there's this funny quote from John Aubrey, a writer back then. He was complaining about how Greek, heresy, turkey cocks, and beer all arrived in the same year.
Wow, so people back then had strong opinions about their beer, too.
Oh, yeah.
Sounds familiar, but to be honest, what we call beer today is completely different from those medieval brews, right?
You're totally right. And that's because up until the 18th century, beer had this really smoky flavor because of how they made the malt.
Smoky beer.
Well, back then, they would dry the malt over these fires using wood or charcoal or straw, and that gave the beer this smoky taste.
Wow, I can't even imagine what that would taste like. So what changed?
The Industrial Revolution brought all these new inventions that completely changed how they made beer. Things like steam engines, thermometers, and these things called hydrometers. They all made brewing a lot more efficient and consistent.
So that's when brewing became more of a science.
Exactly. And with these new technologies, brewers could start using lighter malts, and they just add a bit of dark malt to give the beer some color. So no more smoky beer, and you have the lighter beers that we're used to today.
That's a pretty huge change.
Yeah.
And speaking of huge changes, we can't forget about Louis Pasteur, who figured out that yeast was what made fermentation happen.
Oh, yeah, that was a game changer. His discovery really changed the quality of beer, and it led to the modern beer industry that we know today.
It's pretty amazing to see how far beer has come from those first Sumerian brews to like all the different kinds of beer we have now.
Yeah, it really shows you how creative humans are and how much we love this drink
You do.
and how we're always mixing the old ways with new ideas. But maybe we should save that conversation for another time.
Mm.
It's really interesting how beer has always been at the forefront of, like, innovation, not just in brewing, but in other areas too.
Oh, yeah, like how?
Well, take the hydrometer, for instance.
Okay.
It was developed because brewers needed to be more precise with their measurements, but then it ended up changing fields like chemistry and medicine.
That's a good point. It's like beer had this unexpected influence on, human knowledge in all these different ways.
Exactly. It just goes to show you how everything's connected. Who knew that something as simple as beer could have such a big impact?
It does make you think that even the most everyday things have these, like, amazing stories behind them.
For sure.
Speaking of stories, I'm curious about the role of women in brewing. We talked about how it was mostly a woman's thing in the past, but it seems like that kind of got lost along the way.
Yeah, it's true. The image of the brewer has become very, masculine, but it's important to remember that women were the original brewers. They were the ones who kept this ancient knowledge alive.
Right.
And in many cultures, brewing was really tied to goddesses and female deities, so that connection between women and brewing is even stronger.
It's too bad their contributions haven't always been, recognized.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that's changing now, especially with more women in the craft beer movement.
Oh, absolutely. There are so many women brewers and brewery owners and beer experts out there who are changing the game and taking back their place in the industry.
Glad to see that.
It's bringing so many new ideas and perspectives to the beer world, and it's inspiring other women to, follow their passion for brewing.
It's a good reminder that we need diversity in every industry
Yeah,
and that the best beer comes from having everyone at the table.
totally agree. But, speaking of the future of beer, it's hard not to think about all the challenges it's facing, especially with climate change. I mean, making beer uses a lot of water, and those key ingredients, barley, hops, and yeast, they're all affected by a changing climate.
That's a big concern, and I know a lot of brewers are taking it seriously.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's this whole movement towards sustainability in the industry. You have brewers experimenting with grains that can survive drought. They're using less water, and they're even trying to find different energy sources.
That's great to hear. It's good to know that brewers are trying to lessen their impact on the environment.
Yeah,
After all, if we want to keep enjoying beer, forever, we need to make sure it's made in a way that doesn't hurt the planet.
exactly. And it really shows how adaptable the beer industry is. I mean, throughout history, beer has survived wars, famines, plagues, you name it.
Wow.
It's a drink that's evolved right alongside humans, and I have no doubt that it'll keep doing so even with climate change.
Speaking of adaptability, I'm always amazed by just how many different kinds of beer there are out there. We've talked about ancient Egyptian brews and medieval ale, but that's just scratching the surface.
You're telling me from those spontaneously fermented lambics in Belgium to the crisp pilsners in Germany, from the super hoppy IPAs on the American West Coast to those rich stouts in Ireland, the variety is mind-blowing.
It really shows how creative and inventive brewers are all over the world,
It does.
and how the culture of each region influences their brewing traditions.
And thanks to, globalization and beer tourism, these traditions are being shared and celebrated all over the world.
Yeah, people are traveling to experience different beer cultures,
Yeah,
and that's leading to all these new ideas and techniques being exchanged.
it's amazing.
It's almost like beer is this like cultural ambassador, bringing people from different places together through this shared love of this ancient drink.
I love that analogy. It's so true. Beer has this power to break down walls and connect people. It's a common language, a shared experience that goes beyond borders, cultural differences.
It reminds me of how beer was used as money in ancient Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
Remember, it wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of their community, a way to connect and build relationships.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, that's still true today.
Absolutely. Whether we're sharing a beer with friends at the pub or trying new beers in a different country, beer just has this way of creating connections and bringing people together.
So I think it's time to raise a toast to beer,
Yes.
to its rich history, its incredible diversity, and its ability to bring people together.
Cheers to beer.
Cheers.